You a lawman or an outlaw?
Today, a bit of both, I reckon.
There's a big surprise for Lawmen Bass Reeves fans. Will there be a second season? Chad Freehan, the genius behind the show, spilled the beans. Lawmen Bass Reeves is all about the real-life hero, Bass Reeves, the first black deputy U.S. Marshal in the Wild West. Instead of following Bass, we might be riding alongside a new hero of the law. Freehan hinted that there are more amazing figures from history waiting to strut their stuff on screen. So who's next in line to take on the bad guys? Fans are loving the story of Bass Reeves, the main character in the show.
Bass Reeves was an extraordinary man who lived an extraordinary life at an extraordinary time in America's history.
David Oyelowo, the man who plays Bass, hopes viewers see how important black people were in shaping America, even during tough times. He wants people to feel empowered by Bass's story of using his power for good.
Law of this land. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves.
Originally, the show was supposed to be connected to Yellowstone and set in the same world as a spin-off, but it was decided that Bass Reeves would have its own show, giving it more freedom to tell different stories. People are curious about what might happen in a second season, but there's not much info yet. So let's break down what we know about a possible second season of Lawmen Bass Reeves. Will Lawmen Bass Reeves tell different stories each season? Like, maybe it'd focus on a new hero of the law every time. Well, Chad Freehan, the mastermind behind the show, hasn't said for sure if Bass Reeves' story will end after season 1. He thinks Bass's life is so wild, it could fill up more seasons. Even if they don't stick with Bass for season 2, there are still cool stories to tell. Like, they could dive into Benny Reeves' life.
Reeves is definitely the hero's journey.
Bass's son, who got into trouble for murder later on. But don't worry, they could still keep the spirit of Bass alive while introducing new characters. The story of Bass Reeves is literally grabbing the attention of the fans of the show. David Oyelowo, who plays the main character, isn't surprised. He actually hopes people see how important black people were in building the country, even though they faced a lot of difficulties.
You got to the count of 5 to get the hell off my land.
Lady, you got 2 shells in that bird killer.
Then I just shoot you twice.
He wants the show to feel empowering, showing how Bass Reeves used his power for good. Bass Reeves was an amazing guy. He was born in 1838 and lived until 1910. He started his life as a runaway slave but became so much more. He was a gunfighter, farmer, scout, tracker, and even worked for the railroad. As if that wasn't impressive enough, he also spoke and understood 5 different Native American languages. Bass was one of the first African American deputy U.S. Marshals in the western part of America, dealing with all sorts of dangerous criminals in the Indian Territory, dealing with the horse thieves, cattle rustlers, and even murderers. Throughout his life, he arrested thousands of bad guys, and he only had to use lethal force 20 times. Originally, the show was supposed to be connected to Yellowstone, but it ended up being its own thing. That means it can explore different stories and places. People like the show, so they're wondering what could happen in a second season, but for now, we don't know much about it. The story of Bass Reeves is really grabbing the attention of the fans of the show. David Oyelowo, who plays the main character, he isn't really surprised. He hopes people see how important black people actually were in American history. He wants the show to feel empowering. Right now, we're not sure if there will be a Lawmen season 2, but things are looking pretty good. The show has been a hit, with loads of people tuning in on Paramount in 2023. When David Oyelowo first heard about Bass Reeves, the legendary lawman who went from being enslaved to becoming one of the first black deputy marshals out west, he knew he had to share his story. Just like when he played Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Oyelowo wanted to dig deep and show the real person behind the famous name. In the show Lawmen Bass Reeves, which has 8 episodes, they aim to fill in the blanks about Reeves' life and what he did as a lawman. Oyelowo and the show's leader, Chad Freehan, got together over dinner to plan the big finale. Oyelowo shared his thoughts on how the character should grow. They wanted the show to be more than just a typical Western. They wanted it to be something anyone, anywhere could relate to. During their chat, Oyelowo and Freehan found they had a lot in common. They both knew what it was like to balance work and family life. Reeves and his wife had 10 kids, so that became a part of the show. Imagine having a job that's not only tough, but also dangerous, just like Reeves did.
How do I get to do what you do?
He worked in places that were really risky back then, but despite the dangers, he managed to have a career that lasted 32 years. Freehan understood the key parts of the story.
First and foremost for Bass Reeves' story, because it's his last scene of what he had to do as an enslaved man.
It follows Reeves from being enslaved and his daring escape during the Civil War to his time as a lawman during Reconstruction when Jim Crow laws were starting. A big character in the story is Esau Pierce, played by Barry Pepper. He's a former Confederate soldier turned Texas Ranger.
Did you make a home for yourself? Marry, have a family?
I have.
What would you do now to protect?
But he's not as noble as Reeves. Right from their first meeting in the Civil War, Reeves and Pierce clash. Pierce even kills an indigenous boy who Reeves cared for like a son. As the series goes on, Reeves hears about Mr. Sundown, a scary guy who might be connected to Pierce. In the finale, Reeves visits Pierce's ranch and discovers his terrible secret.
Weird connection between Bass and Esau Pierce.
Pierce is making black men work on his land as slaves after they've been convicted of crimes. It's like the old convict leasing program where black people were forced to work for free after being jailed. Reeves knows he has to stop Pierce once and for all when he sees the evil things he's doing. It's up to him to bring justice to the situation.
Esau, he's a very complex character in that he's a Confederate major and he leads a company of 50.
It all kicks off with a little boy asking Bass Reeves if he's a good guy or a bad guy. Why was this chat so important? Fihan, it was a big theme we were thinking about. Bass is wrestling with this question himself, so it felt fitting for an innocent kid to ask him. When Judge Isaac Parker asks Bass to be a deputy U.S. Marshal, Bass wonders if he's really serving justice or just being used by a system that's been unfair to black folks for the ages. The Civil War was all about ending slavery, and now we're a decade or so later. At the start of the show, we see Bass enslaved and fighting for the Confederacy. So he knows how many white folks in the South think, especially those in charge who got rich off enslaving black people. So when Bass is asked that question in episode 8, we're already seeing him in tough spots, like when he arrested Jackson Jackrabbit Cole in episode 5 for standing up to a guy who was re-enslaving folks. And don't forget episode 1, when Bass nearly beat his master to death. That shakes up Bass's idea of right and wrong big time. By the end, it's not so clear if he's a good guy or a bad guy. Bass isn't much of a talker, he's more about watching and thinking. We wanted to give him something that really keeps him up at night. Even though Isaiah Pierce is made up, he's based on real folks who wanted to keep black people enslaved. That's the worst thing for someone like Bass, and that's what leads to the big showdown. Some say he was once a slave, but then became a famous lawman catching bad guys. He was supposed to be really good with a gun, like in those cowboy movies. People tell tales about him catching thousands of criminals and even taking down 14 bad guys. Sounds like it could make a cool TV show, right? Well, there was a show called Lawmen Bass Reeves about him. The main actor, David Oyelowo, did a great job playing Reeves, and the scenery looked just like the Wild West. At first, it was exciting to watch with lots of action and adventure, but as the show went on, it lost its charm. Even though there were gunfights and love stories, it felt like more like a task to watch. Poor David Oyelowo didn't seem to be enjoying himself much either. Oyelowo said at Contenders TV that to attract viewers worldwide, the show should appeal not only to fans of westerns but also to families. He mentioned having a black family in this time period, which is rare. They believe the universal theme should be about balancing work and life, something everyone can understand. Anyway, we're talking about what might happen in a possible second season. Did you know there's this crazy story about Bass arresting his own son for murder? And then there's this outlaw named Bob Dozier who had an intense relationship with Bass, which adds some serious drama. Fans are totally pumped for season 2, but will David O, the show's lead, be back for more? Share your views on the series. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Until next time, see you all.